Chapter 15 of The Boy Scouts in Russia by John Blaine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kangaroo. A dash through the night. Both boys were startled when they reached the open air again to observe how the din of the battle to the east had increased. They paused for a moment to stare at one another. "That is real war," said Boris. "Not like the skirmish here when the Cossacks came." "The Germans are giving way on purpose, of course, if Ivan is right. And it seems to me he must be," said Fred. "I am afraid to think of what will happen to him." "I do not like to think of it either," said Boris. "But it is fate. He has his work to do, and it is for all Russia, for God and the Tsar. I have always been taught that we can only die once, and that it is a holy thing to die for Russia." "Yes, but it is better to live for Russia than to die for her, if it is possible," said Fred. "Come, we have no time to lose, I suppose." They approached the car in a death-like silence. It was still where Fred had left it. There was a little delay in the start. Both Fred and Boris had driven cars, but they were not familiar with this one, and it seemed a good idea to learn the controls before they started. But in a few moments they were off. The car rode easily, and the motor was very powerful. It was a silent one, too, considering its great power. Fred took the wheel first. "We can take it in turns," he said. "Get some sleep if you can, Boris. I'll rouse you if there is any need of that. And I'll be glad to rest myself after a time. Just now I'm too excited to sleep, even if there were no especial reason for keeping awake." There was something so wonderful, so weird, that it was almost ghostly, about that ride in its beginning. Behind them was the din of the heavy fighting between them and Goodwin. The sky was streaked with the flashes of searchlights, and the vibration of the cannon beat against their ears incessantly. Yet the road was before them, and as it lay like a white ribbon in the path of a great headlight, was absolutely empty. They passed houses, went through villages, and in none of the houses was there a light or a sign of life. The whole countryside had been abandoned. "It reminds me of things I've read about the plague in olden times," thought Fred. "People used to run away like that then, and leave a dead countryside behind them. It would almost look more natural if there were signs of fighting." There were to be plenty all about here soon, but that night there was nothing, save the inferno of the noise and the dazzling points of light in the sky behind them, to suggest anything save the deepest peace. Grain stood in some of the fields. In others, where the harvesting had begun, there were reaping machines. But despite the noise, there was a strange and unearthly silence. Fred had driven at night through lonely country before, and he could remember the way dogs at almost every house had bursted into furious barking as the car approached. Now there were no dogs. It was a trifling thing to think about now, but just then it seemed to Fred that the absence of the dogs meant even more than the dark, silent houses themselves. The houses did look as if their owners might be asleep within, but the dogs would have barked their alarm. And so that came to be the symbol of the flight of the people to him. They had many miles to go. After a couple of hours, Fred changed seats with Boris, and for a time dozed, though he scarcely slept. However, he did get a good rest, and when they came near to the stretch of the road that Ivan had told them would mark the crisis of the trip. Both boys were in a good condition for the test. They slowed down at the sound of an engine's whistle, the first nearby noise that had come to their ears since they left the parsonage. It startled them tremendously at first, but then they remembered Ivan's warning. There is one place where, for about 4 miles, the road runs very close to the railway, he had said. The Germans will have patrols all along the railway line, but there is no reason why they should pay any attention to you. Be watchful, that is the vital thing, and especially so when you begin to descend a long hill. At the bottom of that hill the railway crosses your road, and that culvert will be watched with especial care. After that you will have found the way clear, for our nearest outposts should not be more than a mile or so beyond the railway there. We would have seized the line before, except that until we straightened out our front in that quarter, it would have been useless to do it. The whistle that they heard warned them that they were getting near to this dangerous stretch of road, and in a few minutes the sight of a train, sparks flying from the smokestack of the engine, gave them visual proof as well. Then for a time they ran along parallel with the tracks. Fires were burning along the railway at intervals of about 150 yards, and at times in the firelight they could see a dark figure moving slowly. "Heaven knows what this bugle means," said Fred, as they drove into line with the tracks. "But if we sound it, they may make up their minds that we're all right, and I'm not anxious for them to get curious about us." So he sounded the bugle from time to time. They aroused no curiosity. Plainly these sentries thought there was nothing strange about the passage of a military automobile, nor in fact was there. It was not likely that they would know enough of the general disposition of the German army to speculate as to what officers might be doing hereabout. "Here we are. We're beginning to dip," said Boris after a time. "The culvert Ivan spoke of must be at the bottom of this hill. The road gets away from the railway again after that, and when we have passed there we ought to be all right." "There's just one thing," said Fred with a frown. "They must know just as well as Ivan that the Russians' outposts lie not far beyond them. Won't they think it strange for us to be going full speed toward the Russian lines this way?" "No. I think that's easily accounted for, Fred. There is a crossroad less than half a mile beyond that culvert. They will suppose that we mean to take the turn. Ivan would have thought of that, I'm sure, if there had been any danger, that they would not expect us to be traveling on the road." "I guess you're right, Boris. It sounds reasonable, and anyway, if there is a chance, we've got to take it. I'm certainly not going to hesitate just for that after we've come as far as this. We'll soon know, because, as you say, once we're past that culvert, we'll be safe. That's the crucial spot." The grade grew sharper as they descended, and the pace of the car increased. Now, at the bottom, stretching across the white road, they could see a heavy shadow, and above, on what was unquestionably the railway, half a dozen lights. "They've got more than a sentry there. It seems to be a regular post," said Fred, a little nervous, as they approached. "I'd like to slow down here. We're taking this hill pretty fast." "Yes," agreed Boris, who was driving. "But it's not just the time to slow down, is it?" "Hardly. We've got to shoot under there so fast that they won't have a chance to find out too much about us. The headlight will help us, too. It ought to dazzle them so that they won't be able to see into the car at all. As soon as we're close to them, I'm going to sound the bugle pretty steadily." They rushed on toward the culvert faster and faster. The powerful headlight illuminated the scene before them, and they could see a dozen or more dark figures. And as they came closer, they saw that several men were looking at them, trying to shade their eyes with their hands. Fred sounded the bugle steadily now, and saw that this seemed to relieve the watchers. For the first time, he took his eyes from the culvert itself and looked around. The road here descended much more steeply than the railway, and that, Fred judged, was the reason for the culvert. For the first time he realized that the culvert was not quite at the bottom of the hill, that beyond it the road still bore downward quite sharply for a space until it turned. It was plain to him that there were more dangers ahead than those represented by the soldiers on the culvert. The pace of the rushing car was faster now than would have been altogether comfortable had they been on a road they knew perfectly. Here, with the curve just ahead that was an unknown quantity, there was real danger in the sheer speed of the machine. Heavy as the car was, it lurched and swayed from side to side, and simply to shut off the power would not have been enough. Moreover, that was something both of them would have feared to do. The slightest mischance, the most trifling circumstance, might arouse suspicion in the watchers on the culvert. It was necessary, and Ivan had warned them specially of this, to dash under that at the highest possible speed, for there would be stationed not private soldiers alone, who would be likely to take it for granted that an officer's coat and helmet meant that all was well, but an officer as well. And an officer would be curious as to the meaning of this solitary car rushing over a road that had been deserted, in all probability, for at least 2 days, even had the fearful grade made it possible. Then they flashed into the shadow. For just a moment, before they were actually under the culvert, Fred looked up, saw the white faces of those above staring curiously. Then he lowered his head, for he knew that his face and Boris's gave the lie to their helmets. Streaked with dust they both were, to be sure. There had been a mist in the low-lying country through which they had come, and the flying dust of the higher, drier parts of the road had been caked on their faces. But they were not the faces of officers. Fred thought he heard a shout as they passed under the culvert, but shouts were not enough to check them. What they both feared was a volley, and that, as they passed out and beyond the menace of the culvert, did not come. "Look back, see if they are looking after us," cried Boris. "No!" Fred shouted in his ears, for now the rush of the wind made it difficult for them to hear anything. "The light is on us now. They might see too plainly. And if we were officers going as fast as this, there would be no reason for us to look back. Oh, look out!" They had come to the turn. So great was their speed that they seemed to reach it before they were well out from the shadow of the culvert, yet they had traveled 200 yards or more. There was nothing really to frighten Fred as he cried out, unless it was the sudden imminence of the turn, which had seemed much farther away when they had first seen it. It was less what he saw than something indefinable that he felt. Whether Boris's hand was wavering, or whether some hitherto unsuspected weakness had developed in the machine, Fred could not tell. But he seemed to sense somehow that all was not well. There was some break in the rhythm of the car's movement that warned him. Now they took the turn. Took it on 2 wheels. On 1! For a moment it seemed that they must upset. Then by miracle the car righted itself. For a moment it seemed to straighten about itself out and resume its flight. And then together, Fred and Boris saw what lay before them, and Boris tried frantically to swing the car about. In the road lay the wreck of a huge van. It was too much for Boris. He did swerve the car, but it struck the wreck. There was a deafening crash, and then they were hurled out onto the turf by the roadside, while the motor reared and flames leaped out over the wreck. End of chapter 15. Recording by Kangaroo.